Hello, we're Medium, a design and research collective, and this is a series of conversations exploring domestic commons. Domestic commons are the spaces between our homes. They are the spaces that form the immediate thresholds between our private, interior lives and the city beyond. Not quite private, but also not public. They are manifest as valuable in-between spaces that reinforce a sense of trust and collectivity between those that share them, but elsewhere are revealed as unsafe, ungenerous, or neglected spaces that negatively impact communities and neighborhoods. The series investigates the domestic commons at a number of scales. We will delve into the particularities of thresholds and liminal spaces, and explore how the form, depth, and composition of doors, windows, or balconies can draw connections between the private interior world and the city beyond. At the other end of the scale, we will explore the political and cultural contexts that shape our domestic commons, drawing on stories from cities across Europe. The series has been developed on the occasion of the 2020 Tbilisi Architecture Biennale, and in response to its curatorial question, what do we have in common? In an attempt to give an answer, we ask, what are domestic commons, and who has the right to access them? How are architectural devices used to reinforce or diminish domestic commonality? What do domestic commons reveal about the political and social structures that shape them? Is there a language of domestic commons emerging? And if so, where do we look to find it? This series of conversations invite architects, researchers, and policy advisors to explore these questions with us. The series will be previewed on the online platform of the Tbilisi Architecture Biennale and has been kindly supported by the Creative Europe program of the EU. We hope you enjoy the discussion and invite you to take part.
So we kind of thought maybe it'd be nice to start with possibly you giving a reflection on this theme that we've kind of conceptualized loosely, this idea of domestic commons being this kind of liminal space between private territory and a more kind of public ground. That space, maybe the entrance stairwell, the front garden, the kind of street, or even balconies that maybe have a relation both to inside and outside. We thought maybe you could kind of offer your initial reflections on that. We kind of thought it'd be really interesting to talking to you because it feels like a theme that's very relevant to May's architectural work, but also your work with policy. So yeah, maybe you could start by reflecting on that.
Well, thanks, Ben and Francis. It's a really fascinating topic because it's the sort of subject that spans between sort of architecture and interior world to the world of the city and even urban design, which we're very interested in as a practice. But also we have a kind of almost obsessive interest in how the dwelling works and performs for quality of life and enhances health and well-being. And I think this particular subject I'm really intrigued because it's quite culturally inflected. You know, our ideas in the UK about our relationship to the city beyond will be quite different to other cities. By which I mean that we have a simultaneous interest in finding privacy within the home, whilst also being intrigued by what's going on outside. And that's both to help our sense of security, but it's also about enhancing a sense of community. So knowing that your neighbours are around or who's in your area, I think is of key interest. And if you compare that with Netherlands, for example, where they might have a much more open relationship to the city or the street, we tend to hide behind net curtains, but that doesn't mean we don't have an interest in passers-by or watching out for neighbours. And I mean, the lockdown during this pandemic has revealed some of those tensions, because I think actually when we were out supporting carers in the NHS, often neighbours gathered on their doorstep or in their front garden to support the NHS. But then if you look at a place like Morocco, it's very different. The private realm is hidden behind solid walls, and you go through a gate into a beautiful riad, and then the life of the family opens up. So I guess what we're looking at or interested in these two projects, on the left we have Cowdale, which is part of the Regent's Park Estate infill housing, and on the right a scheme we did up in New Islington in Manchester as part of the Millennium Village there. And I'll just sort of identify a couple of areas of interest for us in both these schemes. So Cowdale, this was a need to provide family housing, to rehouse residents who are being displaced by HS2 development, the high-speed line that's going out of Euston. So we had to work very closely with the residents. We knew who we were rehousing, which was lovely because there was a sort of conversation early on with them about what their needs were. But actually their needs aren't untypical, and this is a part of a terrace that we're looking at here. So it's a townhouse over 3 stories. And we wanted to create the sort of formalism that you expect in terrace housing. That's very much about a collective urban order. So you get repetition, you get very kind of generously proportioned windows to wall. But the front door is inset, so you get a bit of shelter as you arrive home, shake off your umbrella, find your keys. But also perhaps if visitors are arriving, a threshold between the private world and the busy street. And then the living room is on the first floor, so there's kitchen diner on the ground floor next to that entrance. Living room has that big generous window overlooking the street, and again it reminds us of the Piano Nobile in Georgian terrace housing, where actually you get a larger scale at the first floor. And then because this is quite a compromised narrow plot, we've introduced a roof terrace at second floor. So although they have a small terrace at the back, a garden at the back, then their additional amenity is at the first floor. And we designed that as a room. So it's very much of a scale of a domestic space, and it's inset. So there's a mixture of privacy afforded by that inset, but as you can see from the hole in the roof, you get light from above, but also views out. And I'm really intrigued by the idea that you can carve into buildings to create these additional indoor and outdoor spaces that feel like an extension of the home rather than just a sort of bolt-on balcony. So I think a lot of our work explores that idea of deep facades, and whether that's about building out from a thermal envelope or cutting back into the thermal envelope to create porches or inset balconies like this. Our projects tend to go in one of two directions. They tend to be about a volume that's added to or a solid volume that's carved into. The scheme on the right at Manchester is a really interesting conundrum. We had a very narrow plot, and 2 rows of terrace housing wouldn't have worked. The plot wasn't deep enough to deliver terrace housing and on-plot parking, which the residents had been very clear that they wanted. But from the outset, we knew that we wanted to create a very strong edge to the street. and we wanted to bring the building line close to the pavement line. What I sort of struggle with in a lot of large-scale volume housing is that houses are pushed very far away from the street, and your first experience of arrival is trying to get past two cars and a large forecourt of parking, or even worse, a sort of double garage, and then the front door is sort of shoved on the side of a house. And for me, I want to celebrate the arrival experience and celebrate the entrance. So in this row of houses, we wanted to bring the building line forward, and so that there's a small garden that provides a bit of defensible space between the pavement and the front door, which can be planted up by residents. But really there's very little space. But then again, the entrance is inset, very similar to Cowdown, again to provide that threshold between indoor and out. They're rather unusual houses. They're semi-detached houses but turned 90 degrees to the street. So you could call them sort of side-by-side houses. So the mirror of this house faces the street behind, and has a very similar relationship to the street. And then they've also got, you can just see in this view, a roof terrace off at the first floor, which again provides additional amenity. And what's interesting about this scheme was that between each of the house, the yellow, the red and the brown, is space for an off-street parking space. Because it's in an area that was not very secure. There were antisocial problems, and residents were concerned about parking their cars on the street. So we designed these courtyard houses where they could park off street. Now what's happened is what we're seeing is that because the houses are at the back of pavement and there's good surveillance from the windows onto the street, and actually the sense of security in the area has improved because of this sort of architecture. Actually residents are tending to park on the street and using that courtyard and that parking space as additional garden, which is wonderful, because the street for me is a natural habitat of the car. I'd rather private plots are used for the benefit of residents, which ideally would be through gardens and roof gardens and terraces and so on.
I guess in discussing livability, I think it's interesting to talk about it maybe in relation to your topic, because much of the focus has been on some notion of the role of public space and the role of commons in its contribution to a kind of livable city. And we can sort of track the history of that notion of livability in a Copenhagen context, in a kind of longer term sense, where we link it back to sort of more radical shifts in the strategy of urban development that were explored in the late 1980s and 1990s, that became Copenhagen's kind of development model, which we know now as the sort of Copenhagen model. And then we can look at the kind of shift in development and kind of gearing up of that livability discourse around 2008, post 2008, which is sort of coinciding with, of course, the kind of global financial crisis and a greater interest in discussions of subjective well-being as a key theme in how we evaluate the success of societies, but also the success of cities. So we see a kind of growth of livability discourse at the same time as a growth of livability metrics around that time. So a lot of these different competitive rankings kind of emerge around this period. So we see the emergence of Monocle's livability index. So, in many ways, we can kind of connect that to a project of the kind of competitive city, and a lot of that is to do with competition for tourists, for attracting global investment capital, attracting a global educated workforce, but also a kind of competition between cities, which revolves in the way it's presented largely around public space, in terms of a public space agenda. So I think, we could talk a lot about, what kinds of, how do you say, kind of spatial elements or products are kind of attached to this livability agenda. Maybe it could be interesting to talk about perhaps how, in many cases, they don't speak to the logic of commoning, but they speak to the logic of experience economy, to the logic of the idea of competitive city, logics that play out in things like attractive and branded public spaces, cultural infrastructure, shopping precincts, innovation districts, these kind of things.
Do you see that there's kind of, it strikes me that this livability agenda started as something that was a way of analysing existing space, looking at certain cities and the way they were functioning and kind of rating them. But it seems that it's almost become self-fulfilling now, in that it's an ambition for future development of the city, which then takes on quite a different role. And somewhere like Copenhagen, it feels like now that's become the kind of one of the driving forces of kind of future development. And I guess you're maybe critical of that, because it then begs the question about which criteria are being used to define this term livability, which, when you're just rating a city, is maybe fine, but when you're also defining the city through those metrics, then does that become problematic?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. It does become problematic. And of course, it comes from a kind of well-intentioned kind of context. And of course, that's about kind of connection to a larger discourse, excuse me, around, of course, the idea to sort of, how to say, kind of humanize the failures of a kind of public space and collective space that resulted from the modernist functionalist city. So there is a kind of ambition in linking the sort of larger discourse around what represents success from economic metrics to more subjective well-being that sort of gets concretized around the sort of late 2000s. And we see that take many different forms. And on the other hand, of course, we see it as part of a longer tradition, which has to do with this discussion about humanizing urban space, let's say, kind of in the traditions of Jane Jacobs or Jan Gehl, which is a discussion, let's say, about how can we talk much more about a sort of experiential, psychological, phenomenological relation of the urban subject in the city. And that's, of course, sort of one of the driving discussions around introducing livability as a kind of ambition, as a goal that's maybe moving from a number of other kinds of ambitions that were either explicit or implicit in the kind of previous regimes of urban development. And I guess that sort of notion of urban livability, as you suggested, has become during particularly the early and middle 2010s, as something which became a kind of regime of sort of strongly sort of politically supported consensus-based term, or representing a kind of consensus for the way that the city would try to focus on the conditions of everyday life of its citizens. And I think that is sort of, it has many positive aspects and positive developments behind it. But the challenge, I think, is also, as you suggested, when that becomes something that is explicitly kind of quantified through these different rankings, we can start to ask a number of questions about what lies behind the rankings, also what lies behind the kind of feedback mechanisms between the rankings and the logics of the rankings and the decision making that takes place at the local level. And I think that, you know, one could see that depending on which different sort of index you look at, there are different sort of emphasis points in those different indexes. So we could see, for example, that Monocle was heavily focused on a certain sort of image and sort of imaginary of an urban subject. And that sort of imaginary and the corresponding sort of metrics for it, we can say are not inclusive. They are not, let's say, addressing a kind of diverse populace which has sort of equal right to the city, we could say. So if those sort of metrics are used to drive urban development, urban branding, urban planning, the argument we could say at many levels is problematic. One of them is that it's a very sort of exclusionary vision of who is being addressed and what kind of ideal for the city does it represent.